The wild card, as far as I'm concerned, in the whole shebang is going to be Ron Paul, especially with that ad that the Paul campaign put out, as some would say, attacking Rick Perry, calling out Rick Perry. Some suggested smearing Rick Perry. Others say simply stating the facts about Rick Perry. Which one is it? We'll talk about it with our guest, Jack Hunter. He is the official campaign blogger for the Ron Paul campaign. Mr. Hunter is the Southern Avenger, longtime radio host, the American Conservative Magazine columnist, our guest on the program. Mr. Hunter, welcome back.
How you doing, Jerry? Good to be with you.
Calling out Rick Perry, attacking, smearing, or stating the facts, all of the above, none of the above, what would you say it is?
Well, if stating the facts is a smear, so be it. I don't see it that way. I mean, I think voters should know that Rick Perry supported Al Gore in 1988. Here's a guy who's known for his climate change positions with no conservative likes. And I think people should also know that Ron Paul was one of only 4 congressmen in 1976 to take that first step to vote for and support the so-called unelectable and fringe extreme candidate of that era, Ronald Reagan. I think that says something about Paul's politics and where his inclinations lie, and Perry's support of Al Gore certainly says the same thing, as much as he might want to deny it.
What do you make of the pass that Perry's been given, especially on Fox News, fair and balanced, not where you've got Rick Perry, who is pro in-state tuition for illegals, DREAM Act, backdoor amnesty. You've got a guy who supported the New York gay marriage law, but then backtracked on that when he got a little heat from the Family Research Council. Why a pass on Perry's obvious ability to walk both sides of the political aisle, but yet manage to rise in the ranks so quickly as he has as the potential GOP nominee?
Well, since when have we had a Republican establishment that gives a damn about who's conservative and who's not? All they care about is Republicans being better managers of the big government system we have. We certainly saw that with our last Republican president, George W. Bush. You talk about exploding the size of government and the debt. Well, Rick Perry fits the bill. For all the reasons you just mentioned, the amnesty, the illegal immigration, supporting Hillary Care, begging for stimulus money for his own state, writing letters to Nancy Pelosi, as we mentioned earlier, supporting Al Gore, across the board, even the climate change stuff. He was on board. Across the board, it's liberal positions like that that don't amount to a hill of beans to the Republican establishment so long as he can win. The point of Ron Paul's campaign is not only to win and become the next president, but to ask conservatives and the party this: what is it that we're winning? Just that we have an R by our name and it's business as usual as Washington, D.C.? Or are we really going to turn this country around, as so many Tea Partiers and grassroots activists insist that we must, and do something about this debt and do something about the Constitution? Who is better fit to do that and who has the record to match it? A guy like Ron Paul or Rick Perry? That we point this stuff out and it annoys Perry is proving our point. He is unfit to be that revolutionary leader who can really turn this country around. He knows it, the people know it, and the more they know it, he's going to fight back with his own smears, and we expect that.
You got Newt Gingrich doing the ad with Nancy Pelosi about both agreeing on climate change. You've got social issues suck-up Rick Santorum endorsing Specter over Toomey in 2004. Both of them seem to get a pass on Fox and any of the Republican-friendly outlets that want to say, well, that was then and this is now. But yet someone like Ron Paul, who comes within 0.9% of upending Michelle Bachmann in the straw poll, doesn't even get a mention, but they don't want to mention the inconsistencies of the chosen ones like Gingrich and Santorum.
Well, that's right. The media have their story, and they're sticking to it. And to the extent that Paul doesn't fit into their narrative, you know, Rick Perry's already the Texan, Michelle Bachmann's the Tea Party queen. They have all these narratives in their head about what should be and how this election should turn out. To the extent that an unconventional candidate like Ron Paul comes along and messes up that narrative, yeah, it sort of messes up what reporters do in telling the story. Well, their number one job is to report the facts. And when Ron Paul almost beats, as you point out, Jerry, Michelle Bachmann in the Iowa straw poll, and they ignore him, that is telling. When all these other politicians, whether Gingrich, getting with Nancy Pelosi, as you said in that ad about climate change, or Rick Perry, all his things, and Mitt Romney, that they get a free pass, that's also very telling. Look, Americans across the board recognize that politics as usual in this country is the problem, and that's a bipartisan problem. What makes you think for a second that a politics as usual politician would be the person to fix it? Who is more not politics as usual, Ron Paul or Rick Perry? Ron Paul or Mitt Romney? Ron Paul or Michelle Bachmann? I think you see where I'm going. It only makes sense that an unconventional candidate would get us away from conventional politics. Do the basic ideological math.
With regard to Mitt Romney, who I thought would have been a better VP choice with John McCain, give McCain the wars and give Romney the economy, maybe he had a shot there instead of doing it with Sarah Palin. But Mitt Romney is now saying, we can't turn to these career politicians like Rick Perry, turning his back on the fact that he was the governor of Massachusetts, but when he was campaigning to be the governor of Massachusetts, being a politician was important, but now that he was the governor, well, that was then and this is now, but he's going back to his business roots, and being a businessman, those are the things that we need most right now to put things back on track. So it's interesting to watch these people shapeshift into whatever it is that they're allowed to shapeshift into without being called on any of it, especially by Fox and the likes of Limbaugh and Hannity and Levin and Medved and Gallagher and all the other Republican suck-ups that just seem to, as you say, avoid reality but play the narrative that they've determined.
Well, that's exactly right, and I'll go a step further. These candidates are beginning to sound like Ron Paul because they realize that's where the grassroots and the primary voters are, that that's what they want. Was Rick Perry talking about the Federal Reserve before the last year or so, or the last month or so, for that matter? Have you heard Mitt Romney say things like he did in the second debate, that it is not the job of the U.S. military to fight for the independence of other nations? Well, excuse me, Governor Romney, in 2008 you ran on a platform precisely saying that it was the U.S. military's job to fight for the independence of Iraq, and you can't say any different. That's sort of my point. All of this language, all these Johnny-come-latelys, I'm glad they're saying it because they're all barometers. They're proving that Ron Paul has been right for decades. He was talking about the Federal Reserve when Rick Perry was supporting Al Gore. He was talking about the Federal Reserve when Mitt Romney was passing Romneycare. He's been consistent throughout, and that's sort of the point. To call that a smear or an attack, no, it's just reality, and they don't want to face it.
Jack Hunter is with us. He is the official campaign blogger for the Ron Paul campaign, also known as the Southern Avenger. RonPaul2012.com is the website. Ron Paul's consistency really is, I guess if we want to use the algorithm, an inconvenient truth. It is inconvenient to the people who want to give us a narrative other than what we know it to be. As far as Mr. Paul's wanting to have the Federal Reserve audited, to take a look at out-of-control spending, this should also then help them to bring up questions about who we have and why we have who we have in government. Why did we end up with Tim Geithner, a self-avowed tax cheat? Because he needed to be the next crook to replace the former crook, Shifty Paulson, who was tied to Goldman Sachs, who made 75 trips to China, who were buying our debt. And you can see how all this falls into place. And to have whorehouse Harry Reid, the Senate Majority Leader, say Tim Geithner was uniquely qualified to be the Treasury Secretary, well, you can't have an honest man go into the room and look at the books and continue to perpetuate the lies and the corruption. You need to bring in someone who is co-opted and corrupt and corruptible even to a further degree to perpetuate the status quo.
Well, that's exactly right. And you mentioned earlier, Jerry, why maybe some in the conservative media are lenient towards a Perry or a Bachmann or a Romney or a Gingrich, but not Paul. Well, how comfortable were they with the Bush administration? Very comfortable, as I recall. When we were doubling the size of government, doubling the national debt, maybe it makes sense that they would want other corrupt people that just happen to be in the party they prefer to fill those spots once again. And that gets back to what I was saying at the beginning of this interview. This isn't a matter anymore. The American people realize it, of who's going to be the better managers of big government, the Democrats or the Republicans. This is about getting away from big government and to limited government. And nobody running for president right now, except for Ron Paul, has that consistent record. And this campaign and our candidate is going to continue to point that out, and it's going to continue to annoy. And I think the American people are starting to wake up, and it's a wonderful thing.
Continue to annoy. I referred to the Bush years where he doubled the national debt from $5 to $10 trillion, and I don't remember anybody on the Republican side of the aisle in talk radio or cable TV questioning the deficit spending or the doubling of the national debt. I do remember them questioning Barack Obama's patriotism, but it seems that the system as it is, the status quo, the gatekeepers of the status quo don't really care if it's capitalism under Bush or socialism under Obama. All they care is that their side gets an opportunity to perpetuate whatever ideology it is that they hold near and dear to their deficit spending hearts.
That's exactly right, Jerry, and you pretty much nailed it, that they didn't say anything. I always like to present this scenario to our conservative friends, and I'm a lifelong conservative. Imagine that when Bill Clinton left office, that we did not get George W. Bush. We got Barack Obama in 2000, and his record for the next 8 years was everything that Bush did: the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, No Child Left Behind, Medicare Plan D, the entitlement expansion, doubling the debt, doubling the size of government. Do you think our friends in talk radio and the grassroots conservatives out there would have given that Democratic president a free pass for doing exactly what Bush did? What do you think?
Absolutely not.
That's exactly right. Now, that says that they were more partisan than principled, because we all know that. They would have rightly called out the biggest big government president in our history at that point, as they do now with a guy who's even worse than Bush. And that's sort of my point. Do we want to go back to that mentality when we give Republicans a free pass for being marginally better than the Democrats? And that's not even true. Bill Clinton looks like a conservative compared to George W. Bush. So the same people who tell us that Ron Paul is beyond the pale, that we don't need to look at him, but we need to look at these conventional politicians like Rick Perry or Mitt Romney, are the same people who were the apologists for Bush and got us to this point we're at now. Barack Obama is building upon what George W. Bush gave us. He's only able to triple the size of government because Bush first doubled it. If we were talking about the deficits and debt that we had under Bush, under this president, we would be outraged, and it would be significantly less than what Obama's doing now. We can't go back to a GOP with that partisan blindness. We just can't do it, and there's only one candidate that's going to take us away from that.
And a lot of people, when you look at what happened in the Bush years, where a lot of people looked the other way, they make all kinds of excuses as to why it happened, when it was happening, but the reality was it did. And, you know, I have Republican congressmen come on the program, and they bring up these social hot-button issues that they think are going to get people out to the polls. Abortion, gay marriage, obviously important issues in and of themselves, but they try and use that as a way to try and stir the pot and say, whoa, you know, you can't let those gays get married. You got to go out and vote for a Republican. But when I look at how that has failed over time, it brings into question just exactly what it was they were doing when the Republicans were doing what they're doing. And then I asked these congressmen and women, well, if Planned Parenthood is so bad, they just got bad since Obama became the president? Oh, no, they've been bad for a decade. Well, really? Well, when you had the White House, the House, and the Senate, why didn't you defund Planned Parenthood then? Why didn't you push for a balanced budget amendment then? Why didn't you do then what you're saying needs to be done now? And the only conclusion I can come to is because it's politically convenient for them to call it out now when they've got a Democrat in the White House.
Well, I think you sort of answered your own question, Jerry, in this sense. All of these so-called conservatives who have been of just as big government status as the Democrats often do, as you point out, use these social issues as cover. They could say, well, I know I spent all this money and all this, but look at me, I'm pro-life, or I'm against gay marriage. And look, Ron Paul's a social conservative, I'm a social conservative. But I often think some of these establishment types just want those issues to be there forever, so it will give them cover for their otherwise unlimited government philosophy, their statism under the Republican brand, because they can always go back to their constituents and say, I'm for marriage between a man and a woman. I'm pro-life. Right. And then not do anything about those social issues. And that's the tragedy of it. I really think that a lot of these guys, if they had the opportunity to overturn Roe v. Wade, would not do it because they want to have that issue each election. And that's terrible.
Sure. Yeah, it really is. I mean, I consider myself to be a fiscal conservative and more of a social moderate. And I think what we've seen in an important issue like abortion, and in my debate back in 2000 with Brad Sherman in California, he said, well, what's your position on abortion? I said, I'm glad my mother didn't have one. I think that's a fairly good answer to a pretty heavy question, but the Republicans seem to think that they can keep bringing out flag burning and gay marriage and abortion and somehow use that as cover, as some type of political cover for the fact that they weren't really fiscal conservatives. They were not really being good stewards of the people's money. And then they make up all kinds of excuses and say, yeah, but what about? And then we see this perpetuation of this non-representative government that I think that Ron Paul is tapping into a lot of now, where people are more and more exposed to the status quo, to the system, to the machine, to the ideology, to capitalism, to socialism, to the benefit of either political party and the devastation of a nation.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, you can. Of course you can, because you're the Southern Avenger and the official campaign blogger for Ron Paul. We'll see what you're blogging about tonight, and hopefully we'll get a good update from you tomorrow as to what took place at the GOP debate tonight at the Reagan Library. Jack Hunter, thanks for your time on the program. Check out his blogging, the website for Ron Paul, ronpaul2012.com. We'll do it again, Mr. Hunter.
Take care, Jerry. Good to talk to you.